as well, and she's planning on going to the University of St. Thomas School of Law after graduation. So I will now turn the floor over to Marissa, and she will tell us about her honors thesis.
Thank you, Dr. Beck. So today I'm going to talk about, for my honors thesis, I'm going to talk about how American criminal justice policies affect Indigenous peoples. So just to get started, I want to preface with I'm going to be using the terms Native Americans, Indigenous peoples, and Indians interchangeably, and they all kind of have different connotations, and the term Indian is kind of culturally insensitive when we're referring to Native Americans, in my opinion, but it's used as a legal terminology, so I'm going to use it in that sense. And I also just want to thank Mike Thompson. He was my honors advisor, so just taking classes with him and his help with all my research has been invaluable, and I wouldn't have been able to do this all without him, so thank you, Mike. So to get started, I kind of want to just give a background on how I got here with my thesis and what it entails. So last year I took criminal law in Indian country with Mike, where I had to write an honors paper there too, where I focused on domestic violence on reservations and how it impacts Native women because of jurisdictional issues, which we're going to get into today too, about whether the states or the federal government has jurisdiction and Native women aren't necessarily being retributed how they should with domestic violence. And so that really jump-started my passion to research Indian law. It's very prevalent in South Dakota with our large Native American population and reservations. So I thought it was important to continue on with that research. So my thesis had two parts. I wrote a 20-page research paper where I'm gonna basically run through the outline of it with you today. And then I also had a roundtable discussion at the end of February where I invited a federal judge, a federal probation officer, and the federal public defender's investigator to kind of talk about their roles and how they interact with Indian country, which includes reservations, and to kind of put in perspective for people at USF, this is real world issues, this is affecting us in the state. So that was important. And so within my paper and kind of what we touched on in the roundtable, I'm going to talk about 4 themes today with federal and state sentencing disparities, pretrial detention and differences in cash funds in those 2 jurisdictions, jury service among Native Americans, and then to kind of tie it all together, we're going to talk about economic and social conditions on the reservation. So to kind of just give a history on what the relationship between the federal government, the United States, and Native tribes looks like. It kind of started with a clash of culture from the beginning. A fundamental difference between European colonizers and Indigenous tribes is that Native tribes see the earth as its mother and it's the source of all life and sustenance, and within that respect, we really should be taking care of the earth because it provides all for us. We should be providing for it. On the other hand, colonizers, they are coming from Great Britain, where there was religious persecution, and they're answering to a king, and so the land and what will become the United States is kind of an entrepreneurial opportunity to make these profits without hiring or answering to a higher being, and land is seen as a profit to be earned. So as we continue on today, I kind of want you to just keep this quote in mind. If Indians lived richly by wanting little, then might it not be possible that Europeans live poorly by wanting much? So along that same vein, with the formation of the Constitution, Indigenous people and tribes were not signatories to that agreement. So with the creation of the United States, natives were already treated as a second-class inhabitant. So instead of a government that kind of yields its discretion to the decisions of its people, as a democracy should function, natives were kind of yielding their discretion to the decisions of a government that they don't necessarily secede to. And so this kind of concept in the Constitution has led to a series of persecutory legal decisions that has negatively impacted Native Americans and tribal life. So just to kind of give a background with some of the legislation, starting in 1851 with the Indian Appropriations Act, this created the reservation system. So natives were forced from their homelands to move to the reservation where the United States could better control them. The United States would restrict their ability to hunt, fish, and gather traditional items, which ensured a high level of dependency from the tribes on the federal government. Just over 30 years later, the tribal way of life was further displaced with the Dawes Act, also called the Indian Allotment Act of 1887. Within the Dawes Act, specific reservation lands were surveyed and then divided amongst individual tribal members, and they were divided into either 80 or 160 acre sections for agricultural or grazing purposes. Surplus land then remaining after the distribution of land to tribal members was then allotted to non-tribal members. And so this act helped to assimilate Native Americans into the nation's economy, polity, while education, mostly in the form of Indian boarding schools, which we're going to touch on a little bit later, would teach Native Americans how to think, speak, and work like other Americans. And so the main theme of this historical Indian legislation was the erosion of tribal way of life and culture. Around the same time as the Dawes Act, the Major Crimes Act of 1885 was passed. The Major Crimes Act is a congressional statute that enumerates a list of violent crimes that, if committed by a Native American within Indian country, so including reservations, whether the victim is a Native American or not, they're going to be subject to the prosecution of the federal government and not the states. And so, with the adoption of the Major Crimes Act stemmed the Marshall Trilogy of Supreme Court cases where the government insisted that natives were a distinct tribe in need of special regulation. Within the Marshall Trilogy, we have Johnson versus McIntosh, decided in 1824, that declared that tribal land that once belonged to tribes, tribal land that belonged to the United States after its secession from British rule under the Discovery Doctrine. And then in 1831, we had Cherokee Nation versus the state of Georgia, where it declared that Native tribes are domestic dependent nations. And finally, Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, as indicated by the Major Crimes Act, declared that Indian affairs were to be regulated by the federal government and the states' governments had to stay out of it. So because of the key differences of how Native Americans are being prosecuted versus other demographics, it's important to look at key differences between federal and state legal proceedings. And so one of the main differences between the federal and state legal systems is the federal sentencing guidelines. So the federal sentencing guidelines are a set of rules that federal judges are required to follow when sentencing someone convicted of a federal crime. The federal sentence is based largely on the pre-sentence investigation report, which is the document prepared by a federal probation officer, where they assess the criminal history of the offender and the nature and circumstances of the convicted crime to then assess the offender a criminal history category and also offense level based on that convicted crime. And so then therefore judges have like a very pre-established sentence length that they can sentence within. While on the other hand, in the state systems, there's not a sentencing guideline for those judges, so they have a significantly greater amount of discretion in handing down sentences. So to kind of exemplify these, we're going to talk about the cases of Dana Deegan, Laura Rafferty, and Jennifer Glum. So Dana Deegan was a 25-year-old Native American living on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation in North Dakota. In 1998, she gave birth to a baby in the home on the reservation. She dressed the infant and left him alone for 2 weeks, which resulted in the infant's death. She was indicted on a charge of first-degree murder, and because this took place on the reservation, she was subject to federal prosecution. She was subsequently sentenced to 121 months in federal prison, which is equivalent of 10 years, and was actually at the bottom of the recommended guideline range. In the same year, a college student at North Dakota State University, Laura Rafferty, gave birth to a baby in the bathroom of her sorority house in Fargo. Rafferty cut the umbilical cord, placed the baby in a blanket, and underneath her bed while she went to class. When she got back from class, the baby had died, so she disposed of its corpse in the trash. She took a plea, an Alford plea of negligent homicide in the North Dakota state court system, and she was sentenced to 3 years supervised probation with a 1-year prison term suspended. Just a few years later, in 2007, a woman from Bismarck, North Dakota named Jennifer Glum also gave birth in her bathroom, placed her child in the toilet and covered it with toilet paper. Autopsy records show that baby died by drowning. She pled guilty to felony manslaughter, also in the state court system, and she was sentenced to 2 years in prison with time suspended. The key difference between Deegan and the other 2 women's sentences is that the mitigating circumstances of Deegan's crime were not adequately reflected in her sentence. While sentencing the 2 women in the state court, the first judge that sentenced Rafferty, the college student, acknowledged the extensive pressure she was under as a college student and how she was rather desperate to keep her sexual behaviors from her mother. The judge responsible for sentencing Glum called attention to the mental disorders that she suffered from, including borderline personality disorder and dissociative episodes. The federal probation officer that prepared the pre-sentence investigation report for Deegan kind of outlined the tragic history that Deegan had. She was already the mother of 4 young children, and they were living in poverty because the father of her children and her common-law spouse struggled with alcohol and drug addictions, and so he constantly spent their money on gambling and his addiction, so they didn't have money to live on, and he routinely assaulted Deegan in a physical and sexual manner. So on top of the vast differences between the sentences that these women got, for Deegan got 10 years and they had suspended prison sentences, there is no parole in the federal system, so that means that Deegan served most, if not all, of her 10-year prison sentence. There have been solutions offered to combat sentencing disparities between state and federal jurisdictions. Former District Court Judge Bruce D. Black in North Dakota argued for a system where Native Americans would be sentenced under tribal sentencing guidelines rather than a federal or state requirement. Under this approach, tribes would be able to craft penalties that faced unique concerns that they were facing on their reservation, and then would be subject to congressional oversight in the same way that the federal sentencing guidelines were. This approach would offer tribes a semblance of sovereignty that they have been searching for hundreds of years, but at this time, this approach nor any other approaches have been adopted for the sentencing disparities within Indian country. Another significant divergence between the state and federal judicial systems is pretrial detention proceedings and the use of cash bonds. So in the state system in South Dakota, for the more serious and violent offenses, a defendant is going to appear before a magistrate judge within 24 to 48 hours after being charged. Magistrate judges in Minnehaha County will fill out a form called the Bond Findings and Conditions of Release. Pursuant to South Dakota Codified Law 23A-43, the judge starts with 5 categories to evaluate an alleged offender: character, compliance, probation, offenses, and danger. Factors then assessed within these categories include employment history, past failures to appear for court, prior probation, prior offenses, violent nature of accused offense, and dangers to victims and witnesses. These categories are used to assess overall flight risk and danger to society, which are the key determinations in the key aspects of bond determinations. From there, an alleged offender has 4 options. So they can either be released on a PR bond, which is a personal recognizance bond, which means the defendant is on his or her honor to show up for their court proceedings. They could have a cash bond, which is a specified amount of cash that needs to be paid upfront to be released from detention. A cash surety bond, which means they're usually paying 5 to 10% of a cash amount to be released from detention, or they're just going to be held until their trial. On the other side, as a general rule, there are no cash bonds in the federal system. So a defendant can either be released on a PR bond or an unsecured appearance bond, or released on certain conditions. Released on certain conditions is used when a judicial officer makes a determination that a defendant does not qualify for a PR bond, and thus the judicial officer must impose the least restrictive condition or combination of conditions necessary to reasonably assure the defendant's appearance as required and to reasonably assure the safety of the community. Now consider a defendant who is charged with murder, say in the state system, and is released on a cash surety bond. Let's say it's $500,000, with 10% of which needs to be paid up front. That's 50 grand. And for a person whose median household income is $27,427, which it was for Native Americans living on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation from 2013 to 2017, it's quite literally impossible to post bail. Thus, the defendant's going to turn to a commercial bondsman to hopefully pay their bail. The issue of issuing bonds by a bondsman is completely unregulated by the government, and because the states don't have jurisdiction on reservations, it's highly unlikely that a bondsman is going to take that risk for a native living on a reservation. And so that negatively impacts natives because the ability to post bail and avoid pretrial detention sets the scale for a defendant's entire trial, and it increases the likelihood of a defendant pleading guilty to a lesser charge to escape pretrial detention. And so to plead guilty, they're taking that in lieu of having a jury trial. And so when you think about taking a plea, it's hard to see if natives are taking these pleas because it's stemming from circumstances of the defendant's case, whether that be their criminal history, their financial security, or maybe their familial relations, or these circumstances could all be further fueled knowing that their chances of having a juror that's Native American are very slim. So the United States Constitution guarantees that all defendants being tried for criminal offenses have a right to a trial by jury, and federal law further mandates that such juries must be chosen from a fair cross-section of one's community. But the definition of community is problematic and ambiguous. For a native living on a reservation, their definition of community may look completely different than someone living here in Sioux Falls or in Pierre. And so even if a native is convicted of a jury that is cross-representative of the federal district in which he or she resides in terms of registered voters, they face a federal jury in a distant city composed of non-Indians who are foreign to the Indian community, who may very well speak a different language and who are subject to a different set of laws and a different process for adjudicating them. Additionally, Native Americans are largely underrepresented on jury panels because of the far distances between reservations in South Dakota and federal courthouses. For example, the most populous towns on the Cheyenne River Reservation, which are Eagle Butte, Dupree, and Timberlake, are 104, 107, and 134 miles northwest of Pierre. The 5 most populous towns on the Rosebud Reservation, White River, Mission, Rosebud, Parmalee, and St. Francis, are 80, 101, 108, 118, and 116 miles southwest of Pierre, respectively. In the South Dakota state court system, the master jury selection list consists of the current voter registration list and is supplemented by the list of persons 18 and older with either a valid driver's license or a state-issued non-driver identification card. Many natives living in South Dakota were denied the right to vote until the 1940s, and natives living in unincorporated territories, including Jackson County, which is a part of the Pine Ridge Reservation, could not vote until the 80s. This has severely inhibited natives living on the reservation from registering to vote. On top of that, neither the state nor the federal system includes tribal registration lists for their master jury selection lists. Another way to look at this issue of underrepresentation is not that they're under-inclusive because they fail to include adequate numbers of Native Americans, but rather over-inclusive because they include persons who do not live in Indian country and who are not routinely subject to federal Indian county jurisdiction. This question then comes down to how do you define community, and the answer very well may lie within tribal sovereignty. So now that we've covered just a little bit about sentencing disparities, pretrial proceedings, and underrepresentation with jury trials, it's imperative to understand what the conditions are on the reservation and how they got this way in terms of high crime rates. To me, the most efficient way to combat high crime rates is to understand why crime is being committed in the first place. I think there's an answer as to why Native American and Alaskan Native females were 4.3 times as likely as white females to be in prison at year-end 2020, or why in September of 2020, 58% of American Indians and Alaskan Natives in federal prison we're serving a time for a violent offense compared to only 10% of Black Americans and 6% of white Americans. Or why, as Native Americans only make up 8% of the total state population, why Native American males are making up 32% of the state male prison population, and Native American women make up over half of the female prison population. And I think the answer to these high incarceration rates lies within intergenerational trauma and negative living conditions on reservations that leaves its inhabitants with little opportunity for economic growth. So the idea of intergenerational trauma stems from the era of Indian boarding schools. There were more than 350 government-funded and often church-run Indian boarding schools in the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries. Like the infamous boarding school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, or the boarding school here in Flandreau, South Dakota, Native children were taken from their home, often by force, to attend boarding schools where they would abandon their culture and Native practices to learn to learn English, to become civilized Christian farmers and laborers. Boarding schools have often been coined with the motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man," and they have left deep cultural wounds within Native communities. English-only schooling attacked Indigenous identity and sought to replace Indigenous languages and cultures. Tara Lake, who is a current U.S. probation officer here in Sioux Falls, told me about her grandma's experience with boarding schools here in Flandreau, where she would speak Lakota with her friends as it was the only language she knew. And her instructors would come around and poke needles in her tongue until she learned to either remain silent or speak only English. Dennis Banks, who was a leader of the American Indian movement, reflected on his experience while in boarding school. He said that my memories are rooted in the military boarding schools I attended in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota during the 30s and 40s. Even now, the varied faces of my friends stay with me. During the 11 years I spent in government boarding schools, smiling was always far from my mind. What days those were. We spoke Indian languages, the mouth washing if we said damn or other bad words, and we learned to march. In cadence, we marched to the dining room, to the school building, and to the gym. Yes, we marched until we learned to run. We all ran away from those schools from time to time, not really knowing where we were running to. In a way, it was our own survival instinct telling us to go, and so we went. But the price for getting caught was the hotline. That was when the older boys would form two lines facing each other, 10 boys on either side, and they would hit you with belts, sticks, and straps as you ran through the line. Can you imagine? A government policy that encouraged kids to punish other kids? But we all survived, though. At times, the Indianness was almost beaten out of us. Then there were the books we had to learn from. Books about white people, white heroes, white presidents. All the stories were about how the white settlers settled this land among savage Indians, or how Indians came marauding, stealing, scalping, and killing innocent babies. All of our teachers were white. Abuse was so residual and ingrained in boarding school practices that when the victims, these Native children, returned back to the reservation, they would feel that something was wrong with them rather than their abuser. So when they come back, when school lets out, they come back to the reservation, they're completely different. They speak only English and they feel defective in their communities. They have missed formative years in their tribal communities, and thus the structure of the tribe is thereby altered. Children have unresolved trauma about their identity and abuse that they have suffered, and it goes untreated. This untreated trauma turns into a cycle of crime. As the saying goes, hurt people, and reservations have turned into breeding grounds for crime because there are no social services or intervention programs for people to get the help they need with this trauma. A person that has been treated as they are deficient will themselves believe they are and begin to behave as they are deficient. Reservations, specifically in South Dakota, have very little infrastructure to sustain businesses and employ reservation inhabitants. The land is largely desolate and nearly impossible to cultivate, thus forcing natives to remain dependent on the outside world, further complicating the plight of many native tribes in their trek for sovereignty. 5 of the 11 poorest counties in the United States were Indian country counties in South Dakota and the Central Division of South Dakota that comprised portions of the Crow Creek, Cheyenne River, and Rosebud reservations. Reconciling the reservation mindset conveys a sense of hopelessness because there are decades of unresolved trauma that need to be reconciled, and natives don't have the resources to accomplish this. A person does not understand adversity while they are living in it, and it's difficult to escape harmful cycles without the necessary resources. South Dakota has done a great job at recognizing these issues on reservations, and they have done a great job at opening a dialogue to better help communities by forming a tribal issues advisory group with legal professionals in the state, and also making sentencing data within the federal and state jurisdictions more available. But there is always more work to be done. A celebration of Native culture and history is more widespread today, but the effects of ethnic cleansing and erasure of Indigenous culture are still prevalent in succeeding generations, and our current criminal justice system must do more to ensure that the ideals of liberty and equality apply to America's earliest inhabitants. Thank you.
Okay, so we do have time for one or two questions. We still have to get to a third presentation. We do have time for a couple questions if anybody has a question.
Yeah, Kyle.
So you mentioned some acts in history that made Native Americans dependent on the government.
Yeah.
Is there still litigation like that in place that is preventing them from breaking out of that lower salary bracket?
I wouldn't say that there's like legislation or anything that's like prohibiting them from breaking out, but maybe on the flip side, like they need more resources and like revenue to like fuel their reservation communities to like make more money, like because reservations are so like geographically far from like big city hubs that like people aren't gonna like travel there for like say a grocery store or like any kind of like recreational business. So I think if like infrastructure in that way was built up more, like for example in Flandreau, the reservation in Flandreau is doing a really great job of like they just have their dispensary, like they just opened a nursing home, and like they're making these job opportunities for natives to live and work on the reservation, because that's like kind of the key idea of tribal sovereignty is like natives should have the resources to live and like where they want to live within their tribal communities without having to like take on a new lifestyle. Yeah, Kristen?
I have a history question. When did the boarding school in Flandreau close?
It's actually not closed. It's still running, but now it's more of like it's like native run. So like it's really like emphasizing like native culture. Like this like terrible things happen here. Like it's a bad institution, but it's been reclaimed to like celebrate native culture and like talk about like what are the good parts of living on a reservation and how can we like continue on native culture rather than suppressing it.
All right, thank you, Marissa. So our third and final presentation of the day